The United States has announced plans to increase the number of its troops in Europe within the next 2 years. The United States has announced plans to increase the number of its troops in Europe within the next 2 years. The Pentagon says it'll send an additional 1,500 troops to be based in Germany before 2020. It says the development would be a display of America's continued commitment to NATO and its collective resolve to support European security. But the additional troop buildup has already come as a surprise to many. This specifically after complaints by U.S. President Donald Trump that NATO allies are not spending enough to defend Europe. The question now is why the U.S. has reversed its position towards its military presence across the Atlantic.
It's kind of a drop in the bucket. 1,500 more soldiers in Bavaria, mostly in Nuremberg and Ansbach and Hohenfeld, and some support units near Heidelberg and Baden-Württemberg. But the whole thing is amazing because in 1990 there were 200,000 American soldiers in Germany, and now somewhere between 30 and 35,000. So I think that it's a political thing more than anything else. Trump is supposedly demonstrating his commitment to Europe, and the German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen said that she welcomes this as a further strengthening of American ties to Europe. So I think it's more political than anything substantive, since the soldiers that are going are support soldiers and brigade headquarters and a couple of missile launch units. So I think that it's small potatoes, really.
Back in July and ahead of a NATO summit, President Trump said the U.S. was paying too much for protecting Europe. He criticized allies, Germany in particular, for failing to live up to their commitments over funding the alliance. Trump went even beyond this and said Germany was held captive of Russia over its energy links with Moscow. Trump's criticisms of Europe triggered speculations that Washington could sooner or later withdraw from NATO. Indications even grew that Europe might proceed toward forming its own united army. Observers believe that these may have forced the Pentagon to move to prevent what could lead to the collapse of NATO through a troop buildup announcement in Europe.
The Germans don't like the idea of pushing American soldiers closer to the Russian border, say in Poland, for fear it might antagonize the Russians. And in some ways, I think it goes back to the old Cold War mentality of expecting this massive Red Army charge through the Fulda Gap north of Frankfurt and overwhelming NATO defenses. But in Germany, is the heart of NATO, and the American soldiers are the heart of NATO in Germany. The British, though, in fact, in contrast, are withdrawing 10% of their army from North Rhine-Westphalia. And in fact, the Germans, more than 40% of them, want the occupation troops out of the country. And they've got a petition going around saying, Americans go home.
The rise in the number of U.S. troops in Germany is expected to trigger fresh tensions with Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin had earlier said NATO forces in Eastern Europe posed a threat to his country. That threat could appear even larger to the Kremlin now that the Pentagon wants to send even more troops to Europe.